before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
The problem is the monopoly game, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve, the private bank, which is actually controlled out of London, is manipulating all the dollars to put them out, put more and more people into debt. So the illusion of equity they have in real estate is coming apart. The players that are analyzing everything are expecting massive foreclosures next year and the beginning of what we call the recession it's going to be worse than 29. It's your house that you're living in. You think you own it. You don't.
Right.
You have contractual right to transfer the airspace, subject to you paying taxes to the state.
Right.
For the Global 2000 discussions that we had, the real problem that they have, as Kissinger says, is there are just too many people on the planet. And 40% of the world, 2 billion of us, exist on less than $2 a day. The summary of the Global 2000 report I put up on my website, nohopes.com, but if you look at it, it makes sense to get rid of people. So what they said, they're going to make godlike decisions on who lives and who dies. Now, obviously, some of the meetings we sat on, we were planning on using neutron bombs on the major cities, because that contains most of what they call...
You actually heard this?
I said it on the meetings. I was in the game big time. In fact, I was making such a mess, they decided rather than kill me, which they could, they just invited me into the inner group and asked me to be the finance chairman. And at that point, I probably would have been, Secretary of the Treasury or something, whatever they wanted to do with me. The inside of the game, when we started using neutron bombs, today they figure that biologicals are much cheaper. They're still planning on, the plan is to get a war started in the Middle East. And they're still planning on using a neutron bomb, or one of the bombs that they've got developed on Israel, and that's to begin World War III, which is all on the cards. And it's going to happen. They even put a monument up to this whole program. It's called the Georgia Guidestones. Outside of Atlanta, and they've got it all set down there. It's all in 8 languages. Basically, it's fait accompli as far as they're concerned. It's just to get the thing going in the Middle East, and it's not going fast enough. I mean, Carter put this thing in, so we have the Plan 2000 with the war starting in the year 2000 in the Middle East.
Right.
Reduce the population of the planet down to 500 million, have one world currency under the Homeland Security, or FEMA if you want to call it. They're going to declare an emergency, which are going to shut down everything. My friends, my CIA associates, I don't even call them friends anymore. CIA is crooks in action.
Yeah.
They're all professional liars.
Yeah.
I mean, they got to be if they have that job.
Yeah.
So that you have to look at what they're doing. Anyway, they're so concerned, they're leaving the country too. Most of them are going to Latin America. Meanwhile, they're closing in every day right now, just closing in to make it so we're going to be set up in these enemy prisoner of war camps. I published a book. It's called Chaos in America. In it, I was asked to build an enemy prisoner of war camp. I put the contract in this book. So you can read it for yourself. This is in downtown Las Vegas, right on the railroad tracks. It says enemy prisoner of war camp. They're all on top. And they're building them all the way across the United States right now. Bush signed an executive order taking the old forts and the army places that we shut down to get those organized to hold the so-called dissidents. Now, what's the definition of a dissident? And the problem is that we're going to enslave ourselves, because most of the people want to keep having food coming in, and you're going to follow the line. You're just walking yourself into your own prison camp. Then we're going to come down to the extermination, just like World War II. Well, Phil and I have lectured together. I know Phil's now. He's dead now.
Yeah, I know he's dead. And so what about what he was saying about the number of bases at that time? I think it was 129 bases before he died. Underground had already been built. Was that all for the elite?
Yeah.
Really?
What are they going to do with the rest of the people? They just get rid of them, leave them above ground and be radiated.
And this is a fait accompli, you believe?
Oh, they think so. Oh, yeah, they think they've won. That's the reason why they don't bother about me talking about it. They don't care whether you know or not. What are you going to do about it?
Occultists around the world believe that once a symbol is created, it acquires power of its own, and that the more secret it is, the more power it has. But if secrecy gives strength to the power of the symbols, they need to give them double meanings to help with the concealment. Albert Pike, a 19th century 33-degree Mason, wrote an authoritative and infamous book revealing the secrets of the craft called Morals and Dogma. In it he writes, "Masonry, like all the religions, all the mysteries, Hermeticism and alchemy, conceals its secrets from all except the adepts and sages or the elect, and uses false explanations and misinterpretations of its symbols to mislead those who deserve only to be misled, to conceal the truth, which it calls light, from them, and to draw them away from it. The adepts, sages, or elect refers to those of the 33rd degree or above, the so-called illuminated ones." Albert Pike says of the symbols within Freemasonry, "Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them. There must always be a commonplace interpretation for the mass of initiates of the symbols that are eloquent to the adepts." Here Pike clearly outlines that every occult symbol Freemasons use should have a false public meaning in order to keep the true darker meaning hidden. When non-Masons or even lower-level Freemasons ask about doctrines or rituals, they will be misdirected with the false interpretation so as to keep them from the diabolical truth. It is only as they advance and prove themselves at the lower levels that the truth is gradually revealed to them. Like we have consistently seen, this system of double meanings is the very definition of the occult. Dark ideas and meanings concealed in full view through allegory and symbolism.
Father, I've got an article here entitled "Two Eminent Churchmen Agree."
Yes.
That there actually is, this is a shocker to a lot of people,
Yes.
that there are satanic practices going on at the Vatican. Could that be true?
Yes.
You want to say that? If I was a lawyer and you were on the witness chair, I'd say, would you say it?
It's out loud. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Now, when we say in the Vatican, it's at a certain level, and there's no doubt about it that there have been and still are practices that are formally venerating Lucifer, the prince of this world. There's no doubt about it.
Mason Bible, totally demonic. But what really shocked me the first time I picked this up, sun god, Ra, Amen, the Father of God, the Creator, published in the Freemason Bible. Yeah. And so we've got all this Babylonian crap mixed in here. And there's an obelisk. Well, that was Osiris's penis. That's worship for fertility. Phallic worship, yeah. Yeah, and the Washington Monument, it's an Egyptian obelisk. There's one at the middle of St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. There's another one in the middle of the city of London. These Egyptian obelisks, what are they doing all over the planet?
And I want to talk now about what's involved in this conspiracy. It may surprise some of you that if you had to put a name to the conspiracy, conspiracy that's come down to us through the ages that some call the Illuminati, some other people call it other things. But I think if you boil it down to its purest, simplest form, you would identify it essentially as Freemasonry. Now that might surprise some of you, but understand that Masonry has been around a long, long time. It may not have always been called Freemasonry. And if you look in the books, the literature of Masonry, you will find that Masonry says it is the direct linear descendant from the ancient mystery religions, from the ancient fertility cults. Now what does that mean? Well, the ancient fertility cults were cults that revolved around human and animal reproduction. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's what they mean. It's male worship, essentially. Study the worship of Baal in the Bible. You've got all these false gods like Molech and Baal and Chemosh and some of these others. All of them, their rites involve sexuality. And that's the same thing that Masonry is. That's why the god of Masonry is the phallus.
The teachers are taught, though, be sure to stress to the students that the earth is billions of years old. Make sure the kids believe this. Now, I happen to be a little old-fashioned. I think in science class we should be teaching science. Things we can observe and study and test and demonstrate. Things like the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics tells us matter cannot be created or destroyed. Well, everything's made out of matter, so if matter cannot be created or destroyed, then how did the world get here? We're here, you know. So that leaves only two choices. Somebody made the world, or the world made itself. There's no other choice. Well, there are a few out there on the lunatic fringe who will tell you, we're not really here at all. We just think we're here. Okay, you can forget about those folks, all right? We're here. So either somebody made the world like the Bible says, God created it, or the world just made itself like the humanists believe. It just is self-existing and not created. Well, if the world just made itself, how could this happen? Boy, the devil thought about that for a long time. And finally, one day, he came up with the Big Bang Theory. How many of you have ever heard of the Big Bang Theory before? I was on the airplane years ago flying from Dallas to San Francisco, and I happened to sit right next to a professor from Berkeley, UCal Berkeley. I don't know if you folks in Knoxville have ever heard of Berkeley or not, but Berkeley is not a Bible college. So here I was on the airplane about that far away from this guy, and we started talking about creation and evolution. Everybody I sit by on the airplane wants to talk about that, so I talk about it with him. And he said he believed in evolution. I said, yes, sir, I figured that. You have to teach at Berkeley. I said, tell me, sir, if you believe in evolution, how did the world get here? He said, oh, it came from the Big Bang. I said, really? I'd like to hear about this. He said, you're a science teacher and you have never heard of the Big Bang? I said, oh, yes, sir, I've heard a lot about the Big Bang. And I believe in the Big Bang, but my Big Bang is a lot different than yours. I said, you tell me about your Big Bang, and then I'll tell you about my Big Bang. And so the professor took off on one of those answers that looked like it came straight from the textbook. He said, well, Mr. Hovind, I believe about 18 or 20 billion years ago. That's a long time. All the matter in the universe. That's a lot of stuff. All the matter in the universe was concentrated into one very dense, very hot region that may have been much smaller than a period on this page. Say what? Everything in the universe squished into a dot smaller than a period on a page? Wow. That's one crowded dot. And heavy, too. Hey, and it ain't the first time it happened, boys and girls. This textbook says, someday after many billions of years, all the matter and energy will once again be packed into a small area, no larger than the period at the end of this sentence. Then another Big Bang will occur. It happens every 80 to 100 billion years. I said, Professor, what happened to your dot? He said, well, over 20 billion years ago, all the dirt in the solar system was drawn into this little bitty tiny dot, and it was spinning. It spun faster and faster, and all of a sudden, it exploded, Big Bang. And the pieces that flew off became galaxies and sun, moon, stars, and here we are, you know, people, nothing but stardust. I said, sir, can I ask you a couple of questions, please? He said, sure. What do you want to know? You know, we got a 3-hour flight sitting that far away from each other on the airplane. And I said, well, sir, I got a question. You said 20 billion years ago, all the dirt got together for the big squish and the big spin and the Big Bang. Where did all the dirt come from? You know, who made matter? He said, we don't know that for sure. I said, okay, now, sir, hold it. If I told you that I believe about 6,000 years ago, God created the heaven and the earth, then you're going to say, and where did God come from? And I have no idea. But you said 20 billion years ago there was a Big Bang, and you don't know where the dirt came from. So basically, I believe in the beginning God, and you believe in the beginning dirt. Don't tell me my theory is religious and your theory is scientific. No. They're both religious. The news media tries to make it look like it is science versus religion. No, it's not. It's not science versus religion. This is two religions. Evolution and creation are both religious. You have to believe in one or the other. The difference is the evolution religion is tax-supported. That's the difference. One of many differences. I said, sir, could I ask you another question? He said, sure. What else would you like to know? Else? What do you mean else? You haven't told me nothing yet. I said, sir, does Berkeley have a merry-go-round? How many of you know what a merry-go-round is? You go round, round, round till you puke. You've been on them before? He said, no, we don't have a merry-go-round at Berkeley. I said, you really ought to get one. You know, you could learn some good science on a merry-go-round. If you put some fourth graders on there and get the high school football team out there to get it spinning clockwise as fast as it will possibly go. Now, if you have a digital watch, you may not know what clockwise means. I'll tell you later. We're going to spin the merry-go-round clockwise. The kids are going to go through 4 phases. They start off in phase 1. They're screaming at the football players. Come on, let's go. Faster, faster. Can't you go any faster? You get up around 30 miles an hour. The kids enter phase 2 where they stop screaming. They just quietly concentrate on trying to hang on for dear life. You get up around 30 miles an hour. The kids enter phase 60 miles an hour. They enter phase 3 where they start screaming again. But now they're screaming, stop, stop, please slow down. Don't stop, though. Keep going faster and faster. When you get to about 100 miles an hour, you should enter phase 4. That's where the kids begin to fly off the merry-go-round. Now, when this happens, you will notice a very interesting phenomena of physics. If the merry-go-round is going clockwise, when the kid flies off, the kid will be spinning clockwise until he encounters resistance, like a tree or a pole. That's because of a law in physics known as the conservation of angular momentum. See, if a spinning object breaks apart, the pieces that fly off are going to spin the same direction because the outside's moving faster than the inside. And we could talk all day about the conservation laws if you'd like, but the professor said, yes, I know about the conservation laws. I said, well, good, sir. Then let me ask you a question. If the universe began as a spinning dot, like you said, why do 2 planets spin backwards and probably 3? He got real quiet, puzzled look on his face. I said, sir, why do 8 out of 91 known moons spin backwards? Why do Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune have moons going both directions at the same time? Why is the sun 98% hydrogen and helium, but the other planets are less than 1% hydrogen and helium? And why are these 9 planets so different from each other? If it all came from a Big Bang, I mean, why are they all so different? Very different compositions. And why do some whole galaxies spin backwards? CNN did an article, Goofy Galaxy spins in wrong direction. I said, sir, why are these things going backwards? He said, I don't know. Why do you think they're going backwards? I was hoping he was going to ask that. I said, sir, it's real simple. You see, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and God did it that way on purpose just to make the Big Bang Theory look stupid. The Big Bang Theory is ludicrous for numerous reasons, okay? If the Big Bang Theory were true, the matter would be evenly distributed, but it's not. Serious, serious problems with the Big Bang Theory. Even Fred Hoyle said, I have little hesitation in saying the sickly pall hangs over the Big Bang Theory. Is the sun shrinking? The sun is obviously burning. You can step outside and look at it in the daytime. The sun is losing about 5 million tons of mass every second. The sun is obviously burning and losing an enormous amount of fuel. So if you go backwards in time and add 5 million tons per second to the sun, you start to create a problem at some point. Now, I don't know what the number is, and I wouldn't give a number, because as soon as I give a number and say X number of million years ago this would have happened, the atheist or the skeptic will pick on the number and miss the concept. The fact is the sun is burning. If the sun were larger, it would begin to suck Mercury and Venus in, first of all, Mercury first and then Venus, and then slowly affect Earth. The Bulletin of American Astronomical Society in 1979 said, since 1836, more than 100 different observers at the Royal Greenwich Observatory and the U.S. Naval Observatory have made direct visual measurements that suggest the sun's diameter is shrinking at the rate of about 0.1% each century, which works out to be 5 feet per hour. Now, whether the number's right, I don't know. But the fact is, it's pretty obvious the sun is burning, and the sun, for 100 years of measurements, they said it's shrinking about 5 feet an hour. Of course, now the sun is gigantic, about 880,000 miles in diameter, so it's not a problem. We're not going to lose it anytime soon. Science magazine ran an article in 1980 that said several indirect techniques also confirm the sun is shrinking, although these inferred collapse are only about 1/7 as much. By that thinking, the sun would have been touching the earth 158 million years ago. And again, that's not my number. Somebody else came up with that as a possible calculation, that the sun would have been touching the earth. The fact is the sun is shrinking. This chart shows the measurements of not only the polar diameter, but the equatorial diameter. The sun has north and south pole like the earth does. Both measurements are diminishing in the last 160 years. It's been observed the sun is shrinking. Now the sun oscillates, it swells and shrinks and swells and shrinks, but the overall trend is quite obviously toward shrinking. The sun is burning. That creates a problem. If you go backwards in time, the sun would be bigger and more massive, which is going to upset the gravitational pull. So I don't think it's logical to say the Earth's been going around the sun for billions of years while the sun is constantly losing this mass and losing its gravitational pull. Here, the world's population was only about 250 million. It looks like the whole population growth curve started about 4,400 years ago. Now, if you believe in evolution, you got a problem. You think man's been here for 3 million years. In 3 million years, the population would have grown. Right now, there'd be about 150,000 people per square inch. That would be crowded. No, man's not been here for millions of years. Darwin said, if my theory is true, numberless intermediate species ought to have be found in the fossil record. Well, I'm sorry. This guy said, since Darwin, many of these links have been found. Oh, they are lying to you. No missing links have been found. Even David Ropp, who believes in evolution, says, in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found. Yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks. You're kidding. Fantasy in the textbooks? That's a fancy word for a lie. Okay? And we could spend 2 days on the fossil record. There's no fossil record, and there are gaps all over the place. Every place where there ought to be something, they find nothing. No evidence for how the whale evolved, or how the birds evolved, or how the flowering plants evolved. No evidence whatsoever. Luther Sunderland wrote to major evolutionists all over and said, hey, where's the evidence for evolution? They wrote back and said, we don't have it, somebody else has it. He wrote to Colin Patterson because Patterson has access to the largest fossil collection in the world. British Museum of Natural History. Nobody's got more fossils than them. Patterson wrote a book about evolution, but he didn't show any missing links. So Sunderland wrote him a letter and said, excuse me, why didn't you show the missing links in your book? I'd like to see a picture of the missing link. Patterson wrote back and said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. There are no missing links. The whole chain is missing. It's not a link they're looking for, folks. Even Stephen Gould said the absence of fossil evidence is a nagging problem for evolution. Yeah, it sure is. Stephen Gould died with a set of my videos on his shelf in his library. I hope he watched them. I donated them to him years ago, way before he died. Hopefully he watched them and got saved. I don't know. So Niles Eldredge and Stephen Gould have kind of resurrected the punctuated equilibria idea that came actually from Richard Goldschmidt. Goldschmidt said, the first bird hatched from a reptilian egg. They got so frustrated looking for missing links, they couldn't find any. They said, well, this just proves evolution happened quickly. Oh, I see, yeah. And this bird that hatched from the reptile egg, Who did it marry? Don't you have to have two in the same place of the opposite sex? I mean, what if you get two males? Huh? And don't they have to be at the same time in history? What if one's born just 10 years before the other one? Ah, just missed it. You got to get them in the same place of the opposite sex at the same time, and they got to be interested. You got a whole bunch of problems, okay? Serious problems. Then they tell the kids to think critically. Which theory best describes the organism's evolution? Gradualism or punctuated equilibria? Look what they do. Kids, which theory is the best explanation? Slow evolution or fast evolution? Do you see how they're giving the kids two options, both of which are false? Which is correct, boys and girls? Elephants are orange or elephants are pink? Oh, man. Mom, what should I write for this one? I don't know, honey. Go do your homework. They're neither one.
The whole idea that ideas have consequences, look at our culture. Look at what's taught in our schools, our universities. We even have things that are taught that aren't even true, and they're known to be not true. There are things like Haeckel's embryo pictures that are still in current textbooks. And there's all these little embryo pictures of horse and cow and pig and human, and they all look exactly alike. Well, that was proven to be a fraud back in about 1884, and it's still in the textbooks. And so we have a system of delusion that is propagated out there that most people don't know, and they don't even know. But there's some people that do know, and they just keep doing it.
One of the biggest lies kids face in the textbooks is about the geologic column. It's a joke. It's a hoax. It doesn't exist. The preacher said, hey, Brother Holford, let's go down to Rapid City. They've got a museum with dinosaurs. I said, man, I like dinosaurs. Let's go. We walked in the door, and this old fellow met us at the door, and he said, folks, I'm a guide here. Would you like me to give you a tour? We said, that would be great, sir. The first place we stopped on the tour was the geologic time scale. We're standing there, and the guide said, now, folks, this layer of rock you're looking at right here is about 70 million years old. My daughter raised her hand. She said, sir, how do you know that layer is 70 million years old? He said, that's a good question, honey. He said, we tell how old these layers are by what kinds of fossils are found in them. They're called index fossils. She said, okay. We walked around the other side. We're standing over here, and the guide said, now, folks, these bones you're looking at are about 100 million years old. My daughter raised her hand again. She said, sir, how do you know the age of those fossils? He said, well, honey, we tell the age of the fossils by which layer they come from. She said, sir, when we were standing over there, you told me you knew the age of the layers by the bones, and now you're telling me you know the age of the bones by the layers. She said, isn't that circular reasoning? I thought, wow, a chip off the old block. That guide had the strangest look on his face. It was almost as if he were thinking. He looked at my daughter. He looked at me. I wasn't about to help him. I thought, man, this is going to be good. I got to hear this. He looked back at my daughter. He said, man, you're right. That is circular reasoning. He said, I never thought of that before. That poor fellow drove 50 miles one way that night to hear me speak in Union Center, South Dakota. Afterwards, he talked to me for almost an hour. He said, Hovind, is everything I believe about geology wrong? I teach this stuff at the college. I said, oh, no, man, I like geology. Are you kidding? You've learned the names of all the minerals. That's a good trick, folks. There are 1,200 minerals. Some have names about this big. I said, you've learned the hardness test, the Rockwell test, the scratch test. I said, no, sir, I like geology. I like rocks and minerals. I have a huge fossil collection, a big mineral collection. I like minerals. I said, but the part about them being different ages is all baloney. But he doesn't dare quit teaching it because he'll lose his job. See, people who don't support the evolution theory lose their job in public schools. That's the way it works. We cover more on that on video number 7. It's a carefully protected state religion. It's all based on circular reasoning. I'll show you. This textbook tells the kids on page 306 to date the date the rocks by the fossils. On the next page it says, date the fossils by the rocks. Circular reasoning. This is silly. This guy says, the intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply. This guy says, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. If they tell you they date the fossils by carbon dating or potassium argon or one of those other ones, they're wrong. That's not how it's done. Fossils are dated by which strata they come from. Strata are dated by which fossils they contain. Circular reasoning. Radiometric dating would not even be feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. This guy says the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. I think the cheese done fell out of his sandwich, folks. Okay? How many have ever heard of the geologic column before? He divided the earth up into layers, and they gave each one a name, an age, and an index fossil. Maybe you saw the movie Jurassic Park, named after the Jurassic layer. Each layer was given a name, and they told everybody how old it was. Now, this was done in 1830, long before there ever was carbon dating, potassium argon dating, rubidium strontium dating, lead 208, lead 206, uranium 235, uranium 238. None of those existed. This was all done based on the assumption that each layer is a different age. They made up the whole thing out of the clear blue sky. Now, it's a fact the earth has many layers of rock. No question. That's a fact, folks. How'd they get there? Well, there are two interpretations. The evolutionist will say the layers formed slowly over millions of years, and each one is a different age. The Bible-believing Christian says, oh no, these layers are all from the flood in the days of Noah. You can get a jar of dirt, shake it up, set it down. It'll settle into layers for you in a few minutes. But the guys, again, who believe in evolution are always trying to erase the line and make you think their interpretation is part of the fact column. Just go home and get a jar of dirt and put some water in it and shake it up, folks. It'll settle out into layers for you in a few seconds. It's called hydrologic sorting. But here they are telling the kids the layers are different ages, and yet all over the world petrified trees are found, like this one, standing up, connecting different rock layers. Now, if you have a petrified tree standing up, running through multiple rock layers, I don't think it's common sense to say the layers are different ages. Not by much, anyway. I mean, how long can a dead tree stand there before it falls down? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 5,000 years? I doubt that. And yet petrified trees in the they're called polystratofossils, going through multiple layers. They're very common. Hundreds and hundreds have been found. It would only take one to prove the point. But hundreds have been found, petrified, standing up. So don't let them tell you the layers are different ages. Sometimes trees are found petrified upside down, running through multiple rock layers. Now we really have a problem. I've thought about this one till my brain hurts. As far as I can figure this out, the evolutionist only has two ways to solve this. He can say the trees stood upright for millions of years while the layers slowly formed around them. I find that one hard to believe. Or he can say the trees grew through hundreds of feet of solid rock looking for sunlight. There's a third way to solve this. Maybe those trees were buried in a big flood. How fast was that calf going? Might be two ways to look at this, you know. Yeah. When Mount St. Helens blew its top, it blew thousands of trees down into Spirit Lake. Over 20,000 trees have already sunk to the bottom and are stuck in the mud at the bottom of Spirit Lake. Many thousands of them are standing up in the vertical position. And those trees are going to petrify. They're already beginning to petrify. It does not take long for things to petrify. Here's a piece of petrified firewood. I've got a piece of petrified pallet in our museum from a pallet shop that cut pieces of wood. Some kid sent me a box of petrified acorns. He said, Brother Hovind, I tried an experiment. I put these acorns in a bucket of water and forgot about them. A year later, I went out I thought maybe they might sprout, but now they're all petrified. Would you like some for your museum? I mean, they're solid rock. Here's a petrified dog inside a tree in Georgia. They cut the tree down for firewood and said, wait, don't cut that one up. There's a dog inside. Turned to stone. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. Petrified hat from New Zealand. Here's a petrified pickle in our museum. I'm not kidding. The guy sent it to me. He said, Brother Hovind, we found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. House had been empty for at least 30 years. We went down the basement. There's a bunch of jars of pickles. A pantry. But the lid to one of the jars rusted off, and inside the pickle turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah. A petrified pickle. The jar was made between 1930 and 1960. That's the year they made those jars. I don't know when the pickle got put in there, but sometime in there. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years. There's petrified sacks of flour found in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, from a flour mill that flooded in the 1910s. We're down in Pensacola. We're going to be talking about Hurricane Ivan for a long time. Okay? And that's just one little storm. Can you imagine a worldwide flood? Man, they talk about that for centuries. Actually, Arphaxad's daddy, Shem, Noah's son, lived long enough to tell that story directly to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'll never catch that reading your Bible, but when you graph it out, it's like, wow. Do you know they're still talking about that flood in many cultures around the world? So far, 270 flood legends have been identified in different countries and cultures around the world. The Hawaiians have a legend that says, long after the death of Kunihana, the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place to live. There was one good man left. His name was Nu'u. He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. One family saved in a boat full of animals. Sounds kind of like the Bible story, doesn't it? The Chinese have a legend called the Hiking Classic. They say that Fuhai is the father of their civilization. Fuhai is probably Noah, okay? The story says, Fuhai, his wife, 3 sons, and 3 daughters escaped a great flood. He and his family were the only people alive on earth. After the great flood, they repopulated the world. Interesting. Now, the Toltec Indians in Mexico have a very interesting story. They said the first world lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by a flood that covered the highest mountains. One family named Cox survived. 1,716 years. Well, the Bible dates add up to 1656 from the creation to the flood. But that's not bad for a legend 4,000 years old. Question, why would there be nearly 300 flood legends? I think it's because there was a flood. That's my theory. All you got to do is fly out west and look at the erosion patterns and say, man, this place was destroyed by a flood. I mean, the whole world was destroyed by a flood. Just fly around like I do and look out the window once in a while. The oldest languages in the world are kind of interesting. Origin of major writing systems from National Geographic. What do they say? Well, they say the oldest writing systems in the world started about 3000 BC. 5,000 years ago. Oldest writing systems. And the oldest languages are modern, sophisticated, and complete. The Chinese said the year 2000 was the year 4700. They think they started their calendar with the flood. They called Noah Fuhai. The oldest recorded capital punishment, 3,800 years ago. The Saxons had a genealogy going back to Adam. The Danes and Norwegians had a king list going back to Noah. Don't trust the Egyptian king list. That is greatly exaggerated. See the work by Corville on that and Evolution Cruncher. Why are the oldest reliable historical records less than 6,000 years old? Well, I have a theory about that. I bet you know what it is, don't you? Yeah. That Bible is absolutely right, folks. Absolutely correct, scientifically. The evidence for a young earth is overwhelming. The students aren't taught that. Students are only shown the evidence for an old earth. Remember the coins in the box? They better deal with the youngest ones, not the oldest ones. These books aren't really science books anymore. They're books about evolution.
I would like to present to you a case for the historical existence of Jesus. Lately, there have been many people who have been claiming that there is no evidence to verify his actual existence. It has become so widely claimed by recent speakers that most of us take for granted what we have been told, although it is rare to find anyone who has actually looked for themselves to verify this claim. First, you should know that this view is a new one. All throughout history, skeptics used to claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or that his miracles were only parlor tricks, or that the disciples stole his body from the tomb, but they never claimed he didn't exist. Claiming that he never existed only became possible recently due to the long period of time that has passed since the 1st century. In actuality, there is much more evidence for Jesus' existence than there is for almost any important or famous person of that time. In this presentation, we will be using only non-biblical evidence. In other words, we won't be using the Bible to prove the Bible. Cornelius Tacitus lived from 55 to 120 AD. Tacitus was a 1st and 2nd century Roman historian who lived through the reigns of over half a dozen Roman emperors. Considered one of the greatest historians of Rome, Tacitus verifies the biblical account of Jesus' execution at the hands of Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from 26 to 36 AD during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus writes the following: Christus, the founder of the Christian name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. It would confirm the following: that Jesus did exist, that he was the founder of Christianity, that Jesus was put to death by Pilate, that Christianity originated in Judea with Jesus, and that Christianity later spread to Rome. Let's move on to Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist and rhetorician who scornfully describes his views of early Christianity. Though he ridicules the Christians and their Christ, his writings confirm Jesus was executed via crucifixion and that he was the founder of Christianity. He says, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship their crucified sage and live after his laws." What this passage reveals and how it confirms the biblical account: 1. That Jesus did exist. 2. That Jesus was the founder of Christianity. 3. Jesus was worshipped by his followers. And 4. That Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. Next, we're going to look at Flavius Josephus. This is what was written: "Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribes of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day." We will now examine the second passage given to us by Josephus. It says, "So Aeneas assembled a council of judges, and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others. And having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned." Even if we dismiss the disputed works in Josephus's testimonium, we still see he testifies to a number of things in the above two passages. 1. That Jesus lived in the 1st century. He performed miracles. Some believed Jesus to be the Christ. He was a teacher. He had many followers. He was tried by Pilate. He was crucified. He was the founder of Christianity. And James was the brother of Jesus. Next is Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger admits to torturing and executing Christians who refused to deny Christ. Those who denied the charges were spared and ordered to exalt the Roman gods and curse the name of Christ. Pliny addresses his concerns to Emperor Trajan that too many Christians were being killed for their refusal to deny their faith. He says, "I asked them directly if they were Christians. Those who persisted, I ordered away. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians worshipped both your image and the image of the gods and cursed Christ. They used to gather on a stated day before the dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from 2 servant maids, which were called deaconesses, by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting fanatical superstition. Therefore, I stopped the examination and hastened to consult you, on account of the number of people endangered, for many of all ages, all classes, and both sexes already are brought into danger." Though Pliny states some of the accused denied the charges, a recurring theme in the correspondences between Pliny and Trajan is the willingness of the true believer to die for Christ. This would hardly be reasonable if they knew he never existed. Next is Celsus. Celsus was a 2nd century Roman author and an avid opponent of Christianity. He went to great lengths to disprove the divinity of Jesus, yet never denied his actual existence. Unfortunately for Celsus, he sets himself up for criticism by mimicking the exact accusations brought against Jesus by the Pharisees, which had already been addressed and refuted in the New Testament. There are 2 very important facts regarding Celsus which make him one of the most important witnesses in this discussion. Though most secular passages are accused of being Christian interpolations, we can accept with certainty that this is not the case with Celsus. The sheer volume of his writings, specifically designed to discredit Christianity, coupled with the hostile accusations presented in his work, dismiss the chance immediately. Also, the idea of Celsus getting his information entirely from Christian sources, another recurring accusation against secular evidence, is wholly absurd. He is obviously aware of his opponent's belief, as anyone who is engaging in a debate should be. Celsus wrote his exposition in a form of dialogue between a, quote, Jewish critic and himself. This gives us cause to believe that he used non-Christian, probably Jewish, sources. On Jesus' miracles, he writes, "Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. It was by means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with the few loaves, these are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power." Not only does Celsus confirm Jesus' existence here, he also tries to debate the source of his miracles. Like the Pharisees of Jesus' day, Celsus tries to dismiss these miracles as both demonic possession and cheap parlor tricks. However, he is clearly grasping at straws. On one hand, Celsus accuses Jesus of performing magic learned in Egypt, then later states it is by the power of possession, then states the miracles were not really miracles at all, but were illusionary tricks performed by a deceiver, then finally states that the miracles never occurred. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus lived from 69 to 130 AD. Suetonius was a prominent Roman historian who recorded the lives of Roman Caesars and historical events surrounding their reigns. He served as a court official under Hadrian and as an analyst for the imperial house. Suetonius records the expulsion of Christian Jews from Rome, mentioned in Acts 18 verse 2, and confirms the Christian faith being founded by Christ. He says, "As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." And we know that the Christian authors were obviously referring to Jesus when they spelled the name Christus. Next is Thallus, unknown to 52 AD. Although his works exist only in fragments, Julius Africanus debates Thales' explanation of the midday darkness which occurred during the Passover of Jesus' crucifixion. Thales tries to dismiss the darkness as a natural occurrence, a solar eclipse. But Africanus argues, and any astronomer can confirm, a solar eclipse cannot physically occur during a full moon, due to the alignment of the planets. Phlegon of Tralles, a 2nd century secular historian, also mentions the darkness and tries to dismiss it as a solar eclipse. He also states the event occurred during the time of Tiberius Caesar. This is what was written. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness. The rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and the other districts were thrown down. The darkness Thales, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the Passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun, and it cannot happen at any other time. Phlegon records that, in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at the full moon, there was an eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak. Next is Mara bar Superion. Mara bar Superion of Syria penned this letter from prison to his son. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. Now moving on to the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is an ancient record of Jewish history, laws, and rabbinic teachings compiled throughout the century. Though it does not accept the divinity of Jesus, it confirms the belief that he was hanged, an idiom for crucifixion, on the eve of the Passover. It says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, some texts say Yeshu the Nazarene, was hanged, which means crucified, 40 days before the execution. A herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. There are many more accounts that refer to Jesus and his existence from the 1st and 2nd century. And this, of course, does not include the many books and letters contained in the New Testament, where even the critics agree it was penned by at least 5 different authors. So we're talking about different letters from different times, claiming to be, in some cases, eyewitness accounts of the historical happenings of the events of this man's life. Some common questions are, why is there no physical evidence or personal writings to verify Jesus' historicity? The Bible has been accused on several occasions of committing historical errors, but has later been proven accurate through archaeological finds. For instance, the Old Testament mentions a tribe of people known as the Hittites. Skeptics pointed out that there was no such civilization in history, yet in the 19th century, records of the Hittites were discovered within Assyrian ruins. Today, we know a lot about the Hittites, such as their language, craftsmanship, geography, and empire chronology. The New Testament mentions the Pool of Bathsheba as a place where Jesus healed a paralytic. No such location was known to exist until it was discovered in Jerusalem as a place where the sick would gather to seek healing. Just because an artifact has not yet been recovered does not mean none exists. In regards to personal writings, Socrates, for example, exists only in the writings of his students. There is not a single document still in existence that contains his original works. If we apply the same logic with Socrates, skeptics use to determine Jesus' historicity, we must assume Socrates was a figment of the imagination of his students. But if we are to accept Socrates as a historical figure based on 4 secondary accounts, we must also accept Jesus as a historical figure whose life was documented by his disciples, historians, and those who rejected his divine claims. In conclusion, a lot of evidence has been presented during this discussion to confirm Jesus Christ as a historical figure. We have viewed accounts taken from numerous authors of different theological backgrounds, and we have answered some common skeptic questions concerning Jesus' historicity. I purposely avoided using biblical evidence to support the existence of Jesus because that would be using the Bible to prove the Bible. Instead, we focused this study on extra-biblical sources. However, early Christian historians and witnesses were unanimous in their accounts that several New Testament books were written by eyewitnesses of both Jesus and the apostolic ministries. If these authors were indeed eyewitnesses, we can believe that they also provide evidence to the historicity of Jesus. Some readers may be satisfied with such evidence, some may not. Whatever the case, I encourage you to examine all the facts for yourself before reaching your conclusion.
But how do we know that the Bible, as we have it today, is reliable? You know, for a very long time, people argued that much was lost in translation. Since the Bible was really an ancient book translated for new generations, skeptics argued that something had to be lost each time the text was translated. Well, they could argue that, and did it very well in fact, and they could say that the earliest manuscripts we have are only from 1,000 or so years ago, or a little bit more. Until an amazing discovery took place in Israel in 1947. And that discovery changed everything. I'm sure you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you know what I want to do today? I want to take you to Israel, to the very place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, so I can tell you about the significance of what that really meant in terms of the reliability of the Bible. Behind me, a desert landscape. But within this landscape was found one of the most important archaeological treasures in the history of modern Israel, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The community of the Essenes lived here 2,000 years ago. Amazingly, in 1947, a shepherd boy tending his flock, his goats in this area, lost one of them and went searching for that particular goat. He came to the caves behind me here and threw in a stone, trying to see if the goat would react. But instead he heard the crashing or the breaking of pottery. That intrigued him, and he climbed down in and he found jars, and in the jars, these scrolls. He didn't know what they were, but he realized they must have some historical, archaeological significance. Word of mouth spread. And eventually it came to the ears of the Jewish authorities, and they found a way to acquire as many of the scrolls as they could. In fact, archaeologists came to this region and began searching in all the caves, and they found many more of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are preserved today because they tell the story of life in Israel thousands of years ago. But more importantly, they tell the story of the Bible, at least in the Old Testament part of the Bible. And what was so amazing about these particular scrolls was this, that those scriptures written on animal skins more than 2,000 years ago are virtually identical to the Bible we have today. In other words, what some people thought would be lost in translation was not. The Bible we have today is almost identical to the Bible written on the Dead Sea Scrolls. What an amazing find this was. Now these scrolls are preserved in climate-controlled vaults where they can be kept for future generations who will learn about the history of Israel, their long history in this particular land.
This next section is called, Did the Bible Come from Supernatural Origin? Or as I like to call it, how do you explain that? So I've taken a clip that has 101 scientific facts the Bible declared long before scientists ever did. or before the discovery of man, and I just highlighted some of them here. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, just to give you a quick synopsis of it, what the Bible claims is that all Scripture is God-breathed. In other words, every single word written was inspired by God. It's actually God talking himself. That's what it claims, at least. So let's go ahead and let's check out the first one here. So the first one is Job 26:7, which talks about hanging the earth upon nothing. In other words, the earth is held up by an invisible force, gravity. So before this could be observed or found, it was actually thought that the earth was held up by a giant turtle, or that it was held up by a giant elephant, or that it was held up by a pagan god named Atlas. So the Bible states that long before this discovery ever happened. How do you explain that? In Deuteronomy 23:12-13, God tells the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, about sanitation and how to be sanitary. It wasn't until World War I when we discovered that we need to isolate our human waste. In fact, you might have heard of those Western towns during the Gold Rush era where they would just throw their human waste. They would actually throw crap into the streets, and it would just make the whole town really, really sick and filled with disease. Well, how do you explain that that was in the Bible thousands of years before we discovered that we need to isolate our human waste? In Job 38:16, it talks about the springs of the seas, the springs of the oceans. Well, this was discovered in 1966, that there's actually springs that come out from the ocean floors. In fact, in 2003, it was discovered that there's actually more water underneath the ocean floors than there is in the oceans themselves. Well, so there's springs that actually come out from the ocean floors into the seas. This was not discovered until 1966, and yet it was in the Bible, written in the Bible, thousands of years before we made that discovery. How do you explain that? In Leviticus 17:11 and 17:14, it talks about the fact that blood is necessary for life. Blood is a source of life. And although we take it as common knowledge today that blood is needed for life, in fact, actually 120 years ago, people didn't think that. And people were bled to death many times because there was this thing called bloodletting, and they didn't think it was needed for life, so they just thought that it would help with curing infections and diseases. In fact, George Washington died from bloodletting 2 different occasions. For a throat infection, they bled him out 3.75 liters, and that's actually how he died. So this was recently discovered 120 years ago, yet it was in the Bible thousands of years ago. How do you explain that? In Genesis 1:1, Hebrews 1:10, and Hebrews 1:11, God talks about the fact that the universe had a beginning and is actually growing older over time. Well, starting during the 1900s, science started to confirm the fact that the universe did have a beginning and that it is actually growing old. We have supernovas, stars that die, and so we know that it's growing old as well. Well, before then it was thought that the universe was eternal. You know, this was written thousands of years before the 1900s, and so, you know, how do you explain that it's in the Bible before we discovered this, before scientists discovered this? Isaiah 40:22 talks about the circle of the earth. And in Hebrew, the word circle comes from the word spherical. In other words, that the earth was a sphere. In fact, it was this verse that inspired Christopher Columbus to sail around the world. You see, most people thought that the earth was flat, and that if you actually tried to sail around the world, that eventually you would sail right off the edge of the world, that it was a flat piece of land. And so the fact that the earth is spherical we recognize today, but this was not discovered until the 15th century. So, you know, the Bible had this written in there thousands of years before. Are you seeing a pattern? How do you explain that? Job 38:24 reads, "By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth?" And so this actually tells us two different things. Number one, that the light can be divided, as Sir Isaac Newton discovered. And number two, that the light actually causes the wind. It scatters the wind. And that wasn't discovered until 150 years ago by meteorologists, that it's actually the light, the heating up and cooling down of air, that causes the wind on the earth. In other words, the heating up and cooling down of air is what causes the wind, and that comes from the light of the sun. So once again, recent discovery, written 4,000 years ago. Psalm 8:8 talks about the paths of the seas, and it wasn't until the 19th century by an oceanographer named Matthew Murray that this was actually discovered, that there's actually naturally occurring paths in the seas. And it's actually this verse, once again like Christopher Columbus, that inspired Matthew Murray to go out and discover this. Nowadays, marine navigators use these paths in order to shorten travel times through the oceans. It was this verse that inspired him to go out and look for it, so obviously it was written beforehand. How do you explain that? Jeremiah 33:22 talks about the fact that the stars cannot be numbered. Well, nowadays we realize that there's probably 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars in each galaxy. And we haven't been able to number them, and we can't even see to the end of the universe. So, indeed, it does seem innumerable. We can't even number them, which is what it says. It cannot be numbered. Well, it wasn't until the 17th century that we discovered this, because beforehand, all that we could see was just with the human eye. So for a long time, people thought that there was only 5,000 stars out there. Well, it wasn't until Galileo came along and the invention of the telescope, and then later the Hubble telescope, that we discovered that there's really so many stars that they can't be numbered. So once again, discovered 17th century, written thousands of years before. What do you think? Related to that, in Genesis 22:17, God talks about the number of stars in the universe being compared to the number of sands in the seashore. Well, gross estimates have shown that the number of sand grains are comparable to the estimated number of stars in the universe. Once again, we didn't know that there was that many stars in the universe until the 17th century. How do you explain that? In Psalm 19:6, it's talking about the sun, and it says, "His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof." So, and this is talking about the sun's circuit. In other words, that the sun actually has a circuit. Well, it wasn't until the 1900s that that was discovered to be true. Estimates have said that the sun is moving between 486,000 miles per hour to 600,000 miles per hour, but it's actually moving in a circuit, a huge circuit, around the whole galaxy. Just like the Earth is moving around the sun in a circuit. So once again, written 3,000 years ago, discovered 1900s. How do you explain? In Job 38:19, light is said to have a way. And in Hebrew, the word way here translates to the word derek, which literally means a traveled path or road. It wasn't until the 17th century that it was discovered that light, in fact, does have a traveled path. Before then, people just thought that light was transmitted instantaneously, like it instantly appeared. However, now we know, and it's common fact and commonly known, that light does have a path that it travels. In fact, it travels at about 186,000 miles per second in a straight line. Indeed, there is a way of light, just like the Bible says. Job 28:25 talks about the wait for the winds. As you can imagine, it was once thought that air was weightless. Yet 4,000 years ago, this was written in the Bible that there was a wait for the winds. And in recent years, meteorologists have calculated that the average thunderstorm holds thousands of tons of rain. To carry this load, air must have mass, it must have weight. Indeed, there is a weight of the wind. Ecclesiastes 1:6 reads, "The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits." Well, this was written 3,000 years ago in the Bible. However, it wasn't until World War II that airmen discovered the jet stream circuit, that there's actually naturally occurring paths and circuits of air in our atmosphere, in the air on the Earth. Before this discovery during World War II, it was thought that wind just blew straight. In Proverbs 17:22 it reads, "A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones." And you've probably heard about those recent studies that show that depression actually makes you live less, and that laughter and positive outlook on life, optimism, makes you live longer. Well, these are actually recent studies in the 1900s and early 2000s that this was discovered, that this verse is actually true. I like this next one because it takes what evolutionists who try to push this theory of cavemen were the first primitive ancestors and tells exactly what they were. Job 30:1-8 talks about cavemen, that certain vile men who were derived from society to forage among the bushes for survival and who lived in the clefts of the valleys and in caves of the earth and the rocks. In other words, cavemen were simply outcasts and homeless people, and not our primitive ancestors as evolutionists want you to believe. So those are the ones that I wanted to summarize from that 101 video. There's many more in that video. As you can imagine, there's 101 total that he lists. However, I'd like to list a few more here that weren't in that. Job 9:8, Isaiah 42:5, Jeremiah 51:15, and Zechariah 12:1 tells us that God and God alone stretches out the heavens. He keeps on talking about stretches out the heavens, stretching out the heavens. Well, heavens, he's talking about the universe. That's what he calls it in the Bible. And so this was actually discovered in 1929 by Edwin Hubble. And it was actually Einstein who proposed that the universe was static. In other words, not expanding, not contracting, just standing still before that. In fact, it was Einstein's biggest blunder, in other words, his biggest mistake that he'd ever made. And he later admitted that he made that mistake after the discovery of Edwin Hubble in 1929. So it's in the Bible numerous times, and yet we have probably one of the smartest people in the world that most people, Americans, can think of, Einstein, is wrong. And I think this is just God saying that, look, the smartest person you can think of, I'm smarter than that. I'm God. And so, He is all-knowing. Job 38:31 reads, "Can you bind the clusters of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion?" And in the King James it reads, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion?" Here the Bible is talking about Orion and Pleiades, which are star clusters. Well, amazingly enough, the Bible is right about both these clusters. We weren't able to examine them until the telescope invention, but the star cluster of Orion has now been confirmed to be loose. In other words, it does not have enough gravitational pull to hold itself together. It's literally falling apart. And at the same time, Pleiades is held together by gravitational force. It's not one that is falling apart. In Genesis 3:15, God mentions that the woman has seeds. And although it's a widely known fact today that women have seeds or eggs, scientists didn't discover this till 200 or 300 years ago. See, back then, it was actually believed that the man's seed was all that was necessary in order to create life. So, once again, this discovery was a relatively recent discovery, yet it was written thousands of years ago in the Bible. And the last one here, Job 38:28, God talks about the Father of rain and dew, which is humidity, hath the rain of Father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? And humidity was not discovered until 1650. So those are just some proofs of the Bible to consider. Like I said, there's a clip that has 101 of them. I just included a few of them and add some more that it didn't have. There is plenty of evidence that shows that the Bible has supernatural origin and has prophesied beforehand what scientists later discovered. The fact of the matter is, God wrote this book, people. He is the creator of all that we have in front of us today. And now, what do we have next? We have Revelation. We have Armageddon, the upcoming Armageddon. It's going to happen very, very soon, probably within Obama's presidency. They are so close to starting this thing, and we have a choice. There's spiritual warfare going on, people, and time is running out. It is almost gone.